If you visit London today and walk past the grand buildings of Westminster, you will see bronze statues of Winston Churchill standing defiant against tyranny. You will see war memorials carved with the names of the brave who died fighting fascism. The British Museum displays artifacts celebrating the empire that once ruled a quarter of the earth. Tour guides will tell you how Britain stood alone against Hitler, how the British people mortgaged their future to save civilization, how by 1945 this small island nation was financially ruined but morally victorious. This is the story we have been taught to believe. But there is another story, a story written not in marble monuments, but in dusty financial ledgers. A story that lives in the memories of Indian villages where grandmothers still speak of the hunger that came during the war. A story that shows Britain did not bankrupt itself fighting the Nazis. Instead, Britain found a way to make its poorest subjects pay the bill. This is the story of how the British Empire executed the largest financial theft in modern history, draining hundreds of billions from India while millions starved, and then refusing to pay it back. This is the story of the Sterling Scandal. To understand how this theft was engineered, you need to understand something called the Sterling Area. Before the Second World War began, the British Empire was not just a political system, it was a financial system. Every colony from India to Kenya to Malaya was locked into a currency arrangement controlled from London. The rules were simple but absolute. All colonies had to keep their national reserves in British pounds. They could not hold gold. They could not hold American dollars. They had to deposit their wealth in the Bank of England. This meant that when India earned money by exporting tea or cotton, that money did not stay in India. It was automatically converted into pounds and held in British banks. The financial heart of half the world beat in the city of London. For Britain, this system was brilliant. It meant they had access to a massive pool of capital that they could use whenever they needed it. For the colonies, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain faced an immediate crisis. Modern warfare is expensive beyond imagination. You need steel to build tanks. You need rubber for tires. You need oil to power ships. You need millions of tons of grain to feed soldiers. Britain is a small island with limited natural resources. It had to buy everything from abroad. In the first 2 years of the war, Britain paid for these supplies using its gold reserves. They shipped gold bars across the Atlantic to buy weapons and food from America, but gold runs out. By 1941, the vaults of the Bank of England were nearly empty. Britain was technically bankrupt. They could no longer pay cash for the tools of war. The Americans were willing to help through a program called Lend-Lease, but that only covered supplies from the United States. Britain still needed massive amounts of goods from its empire. And this is where the crime began. The crown jewel of the British Empire was India. India was not just a source of soldiers, although it provided 2.5 million troops to the Allied cause. India was an industrial powerhouse. It produced textiles for uniforms, steel for weapons, leather for boots, and most importantly, food. The British war effort in North Africa and the Middle East depended entirely on Indian supplies. Every army base from Cairo to Baghdad was fed with rice grown in Bengal and Punjab. But Britain had a problem. They had no money to pay Indian suppliers. So the British Treasury invented a financial mechanism that was elegant in its simplicity and monstrous in its consequences. When the British military needed supplies from India, they would place orders through the Indian colonial government. The Indian government would pay local farmers and factory owners in rupees, the local Indian currency. But when it came time for Britain to pay India back, they did not send rupees, they did not send gold, they did not send anything real. Instead, a clerk in the Bank of England would simply write a number in a ledger book. Britain would credit India's account with British pounds. On paper, this looked like a fair trade. India was selling goods and Britain was paying for them. The Indian government's account in London was growing rapidly. These credit entries became known as the sterling balances. By the end of the war, India had accumulated £1.3 billion in these accounts. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that represents over $400 billion. It was an astronomical sum. It technically made India one of the richest creditor nations in the world. Britain was deeply in debt to its colony. But there was a catch so cynical it transforms this transaction from trade into theft. The British government declared that these sterling balances were blocked. India could not withdraw the money. They could not convert the pounds into dollars to buy machinery from America. They could not use it to buy gold or invest it anywhere outside Britain. The money was frozen. It existed only as numbers in a ledger that India could look at but never touch. Britain was taking real goods, real food, real labor from India and paying for it with an IOU that could never be cashed. It was the financial equivalent of paying your workers with monopoly money. The consequences of this system on the ground in India were catastrophic, because the Indian government had to print millions of new rupees to pay local producers for the war supplies. The money supply in India exploded. At the same time, all the goods that money would normally buy, the rice, the cloth, the cooking oil, were being shipped out of the country to feed British soldiers. This created a perfect storm. Too much money, chasing too few goods. The result was hyperinflation. Between 1939 and 1945, prices in India increased by 300%. The cost of rice, the staple food of millions, became so high that ordinary families could no longer afford to eat. The poor, who lived day to day on manual labor wages, found that a full day's work would not buy a single meal for their children. This was not an accidental side effect. It was understood and accepted by British policymakers. The economist John Maynard Keynes, celebrated today as a progressive thinker who helped build the modern welfare state, was a key architect of the system. As an advisor to the British Treasury during the war, Keynes wrote internal memos explaining exactly what was happening. He called it a forced transfer of real resources. He knew that by inflating India's currency while extracting its goods, Britain was reducing the consumption of Indian peasants to increase the consumption of British soldiers. He understood that people would go hungry. He considered it an acceptable cost. In one chilling memo, he calculated how much inflation India could tolerate before the system broke down. He was essentially calculating how much suffering the Indian population could endure before they revolted. The most horrific result of this financial engineering was the Bengal Famine of 1943. 3 million people died. When we learn about this famine in history books, it is often blamed on a cyclone that destroyed crops, or the Japanese invasion of Burma that cut off rice supplies. These were contributing factors, but they were not the primary cause. The primary cause was the inflation created by the sterling system. The British government was buying up enormous quantities of rice to feed troops and to stockpile in case of invasion. They were paying for this rice by printing rupees in India. The price of rice in Bengal increased so fast that farmers began hoarding it, hoping to sell it for even higher prices later. Meanwhile, poor laborers who were paid fixed wages found themselves priced out of the market. They did not die because there was no food in Bengal. Ships full of grain were leaving Calcutta harbor bound for British-controlled territories even as people starved on the docks. They died because the financial system had inflated the price of food beyond their reach. The famine was not a natural disaster, it was a policy outcome. While millions died in the streets of Calcutta, the sterling balances in London continued to grow. Every sack of rice taken from a starving village added another entry to India's frozen account. It is a grotesque image. A mountain of paper wealth accumulating in British banks, built literally on the corpses of Indian peasants. British officials in India were fully aware of what was happening. The Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, sent urgent cables to London warning that the financial pressure on India was unbearable. He warned that they were destroying the Indian economy and risking mass unrest, but Winston Churchill and his war cabinet had other priorities. Defeating Hitler was paramount. If India had to be squeezed until it bled to pay for that victory, then so be it. Churchill's views on India were openly racist. When informed of the famine, he reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet and commented that Indians bred like rabbits. He saw the debt Britain was accumulating to India not as a legitimate obligation, but as an absurdity. How could the master owe money to the servant? By 1945, the war was over. The Union Jack still flew over India, but not for much longer. Independence was coming, and with independence came the question of the debt. India's new leaders, men like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, looked at that £1.3 billion as the seed capital for their new nation. They planned to use it to build steel mills, power plants, universities, hospitals. They believed that Britain, having forced India to sacrifice so much for the war, would honor its financial obligation. They were spectacularly wrong. The betrayal began in the negotiations immediately after the war. The British government made it clear they had no intention of paying the full debt. Leading British politicians began a propaganda campaign to reframe the sterling balances as illegitimate. They argued that since Britain had fought the war to defend the empire, including India, the colonies should have contributed freely. Some even suggested that Britain should present India with a counter bill for the cost of defense. Winston Churchill wanted to simply default outright. He drafted memos proposing that Britain tell India the debt was cancelled, but the new Labour government, under Clement Attlee, realized that a complete default would destroy global confidence in the British pound. If Britain simply refused to pay its debts, no one would ever trust London's financial markets again. They needed a more sophisticated method. They needed to default without calling it a default. The solution was elegant. Britain told India that the sterling balances would remain blocked for the foreseeable future. India would be allowed to withdraw only a tiny amount each year, just enough to pay for essential imports. The rest would stay frozen in London. The excuse was that the British economy was too fragile to handle a sudden withdrawal. If they released the money too fast, they claimed, the pound would collapse and that would hurt everyone, including India. It was economic hostage-taking dressed up as fiscal responsibility. India, desperate for hard currency and lacking any alternative, was forced to accept these terms. But Britain had an even darker plan. They would devalue the debt away. In September 1949, the British government announced a sudden devaluation of the pound against the US dollar by 30%. Overnight, the pound lost a third of its international purchasing power. For Britain, this was painful but strategically useful. It made British exports cheaper and helped the economy recover. But for India, it was a catastrophe. India's reserves were held entirely in pounds. When the pound collapsed, India lost 30% of its national savings in a single day. The American machinery they wanted to buy suddenly cost 30% more. The development plans they had made were now unaffordable. Economists have calculated that this single devaluation wiped out more wealth than the entire cost of the Bengal Famine. It was a default executed through monetary policy, and it did not stop there. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, inflation in Britain steadily eroded the real value of the sterling balances. The interest rate Britain paid on these frozen accounts was far below the inflation rate. Every year, the money sat in London. It bought less and less. It was melting away like ice in the sun. Meanwhile, Britain was enjoying a post-war boom. The National Health Service was founded. Council housing was built. The welfare state expanded. Where did the money come from? Part of it came from American loans, but a significant portion came from the cheap imports and blocked sterling balances from the empire. The comfortable life of the average British family in the 1950s was subsidized by the frozen savings of Indian farmers. By the time India finally gained access to the last of the sterling balances in the 1970s, inflation had reduced them to a fraction of their original value. The great fortune that was supposed to rebuild India after independence had evaporated. The dream of rapid industrialization died with it. Instead, India spent decades in poverty, begging for aid from the World Bank and IMF, often accepting humiliating conditions, while its own money had been stolen in plain sight. The economist Utsa Patnaik has calculated the total drain of wealth from India during the colonial period. When you include trade manipulation, tax extraction, and mechanisms like the sterling balances, she estimates Britain took $45 trillion from India. That number is almost incomprehensible. It is 17 times the current GDP of the United Kingdom. This story is not taught in British schools. The monuments in London do not mention it. The narrative remains that Britain heroically bankrupted itself to save the world from fascism. But the financial records tell a different truth. Britain saved itself by bankrupting its colonies. The empire was not a burden, it was a resource to be mined. And in Britain's darkest hour, it mined that resource without mercy. The sterling scandal reveals something uncomfortable about the so-called Good War. Yes, the Allies defeated fascism. That was morally necessary. But the cost of that victory was not shared equally. Indian peasants paid with their lives and their futures so that British citizens could rebuild in comfort. The bill for defeating Hitler was sent to the poorest people on earth. And when they asked to be reimbursed, they were told the check was in the mail. It never arrived.